The first time the wind ripped the roof clean off a neighbor's barn, no one laughed at her anymore. But by then, the horses were already dead, froze stiff, tongues stuck to their own teeth. Snow packed so high the drifts were scraping beams inside what used to be shelters. That winter didn't give second chances. It didn't send warnings twice. It just came. But weeks before that storm ever formed, before the sky even started to darken, back when the creek was still running and the pine needles hadn't vanished under snowpack 5 feet deep, Ada Gray was already working, already hammering, already sawing, and already being laughed at by every neighbor within earshot. Because who in their right mind wraps a whole barn inside another building? That was the question they asked, with smirks, with raised brows, with that frontier tone, casual but cruel, always somewhere between, "Ma'am, you're doing it wrong," and "Ma'am, you're gonna kill something." Ada didn't answer. Not then, not once. Not when Clyde Maples shouted that he'd never seen a barn so mollycoddled. Not when Joseph Prewitt pointed and said she was building a shed for her shed. Not even when young boys from the Crowsfield Ranch rode past and called it a barn burrito. Because Ada wasn't listening to them. She was listening to the wind, and she remembered last winter, and the one before that, and the 2 horses she lost. Her land sat lower than most. The whole western edge sloped toward a marshy basin that turned into a bog in spring. But in winter, it became a funnel for wind, like a corridor carved by nature, a low, invisible chute where the cold built up and then charged downhill like a herd of ghosts. Other cabins farther uphill might get whipped by gusts, sure, but Ada's barn got punched, direct, relentless. She'd seen frost clinging to the inside of her horses' nostrils by morning, seen icicles hang from the very edges of their manes. She buried her stallion last March with a pickaxe and her bare hands when the ground refused to thaw. So this year, she wasn't waiting. She built, not a second barn, not a proper house, just a wrapping, a full shell, wall by wall, stud by stud, a shed around the entire existing structure, as if she were putting a coat on an old friend who couldn't shiver anymore. And every day she worked, the voices came again. "You think your barn's cold, Ada?" one rancher barked. "How you think the buffalo made it through winter without 2 shirts on? I heard she's got wallpaper inside that barn," another whispered at the post office. "Should we get her a parlor stove too?" But Ada kept her jaw set and her hands moving. She wasn't after pride. She was after something warmer, life. It wasn't easy work, not alone. She didn't have sons to lift lumber, no brothers to help frame. Her husband died 6 years prior. Diphtheria took him fast and quiet. And since then, she'd done everything with the strength she could find in herself or borrow from whatever stubbornness the mountain put in her bones. When she wrapped that barn, she climbed ladders with one hand while holding boards with the other. She hammered with her mittens on when she could, without them when she couldn't. She used salvaged planks from a collapsed chicken coop. She used old canvas from an army tent for a vapor barrier. She filled gaps with straw. She stuffed dry moss into every seam she could find. Every creak the barn had ever made in winter. She listened for it, then sealed it. By the second week of December, the whole thing looked absurd. A square, boxy shadow around the original frame, as if someone had tried to sketch the barn in thicker lines. Even she had to admit it was ugly, unpainted, haphazard, a Frankenstein of wood scraps and second-hand nails, but it held still when the wind came, and the horses inside stopped trembling at night. Ada's horses weren't just pets. They weren't even just work animals. They were her income. 2 mares, heavy-hooved and thick-necked, bred from good stock, trained to haul freight down to Dawson Creek and back twice a month. The valley depended on horse freight more than most would admit. You could mock a woman for having no man, but you still needed someone to deliver oats and lamp oil and letters from the telegraph. That was Ada. That was her team. So when she laid down floor straw for the 3rd time that month and didn't find it frozen to the baseboards anymore, she said nothing aloud, but her face hardened in a new way, as if she were memorizing something for the future. The weather shifted overnight. They'd seen cold before, but not like this. Not this fast, not this cruel. It came down from the north like a falling axe. The lake froze overnight, solid. Chickens were found stiff on their perches. Wagons left out cracked their wheels in 2. And inside barns, even good ones, even well-built ones, something unholy began to take hold. The horses started to die, not all at once, not everywhere, but in waves, first in the shallow valleys, then in the barn houses built too close to creeks, then higher, then farther. It was 22nd degree by the 2nd week of the cold snap, and even the toughest ranchers weren't joking anymore. They weren't even visiting. No one came down the road to mock Ada's wrapped barn now. They were too busy digging graves, or worse, dragging bodies into sheds because the ground had frozen into iron. But Ada's barn held. She didn't say say a word about it, but the steam rising from its roof told the whole story. One morning, day 10 of the freeze, a rider came. His name was Elijah, the youngest Prewitt boy, barely 16, red-eyed, wild with panic. His family's barn had collapsed overnight, and the mares had gone with it. They had one gelding left, barely alive, lips white with frost. I heard your barn's still. Can we put him there? Adah didn't even hesitate. She just stepped outside, threw on her coat and said, bring him. The boy cried when she helped him off the horse, and by afternoon, there were 4 more horses inside her barn. That night, for the first time in a month, it snowed again. Not a blizzard, not a storm, just snow, the kind that feels like a curtain falling after a performance. A hush, a mercy. But Adah didn't sleep. She sat on the bench inside her wrapped barn, back against a warm post, blanket over her lap, oil lamp flickering, watching the rise and fall of sleeping horses, none of them trembling, no frost on their flanks. And as dawn came, she could already hear distant hoofbeats outside. More riders coming, not to laugh, to beg, to ask if there was room for one more. She closed her eyes, took a breath, tightened the blanket around her shoulders, and said nothing. By the 12th day of the freeze, Adah's barn stopped being hers. It became something else, something the townsfolk didn't have a name for yet, but they all understood. A last place, a final try, a stubborn ember in a valley that had turned white and still and brittle with death. And once word got around that her wrapped barn was not only standing but steaming with heat inside, folks stopped asking permission. They just came. At first it was horses, half dead, staggering animals with frostbitten lips and hooves split from cold. But then it was people too. A man named Darrell who couldn't get a match lit back home. A woman named Ruth with twin boys, their noses purple and fingers stiff. She came walking 2 miles uphill with one boy draped over her shoulder and the other clinging to her hip because she'd seen smoke coming from Adah's stovepipe. Not many homes still had that. Adah saw them first from the edge of her window. She didn't say a word, just slipped her arms into her old wool coat, pulled on her boots, and walked out into the wind, opened the barn door wide. When Ruth collapsed to her knees in the snow, Adah picked up both boys without a grunt and carried them in herself. No one laughed anymore. Inside the wrapped barn, the air had taken on something close to sacred. Not warm, not really, but not freezing either. It was the kind of air that didn't steal breath, that didn't cut flesh, a miracle by this winter's standards. There were over a dozen horses by the end of that day, crowded into a space meant for 6. Adah spent hours repacking the straw, moving crates, and building makeshift partitions with old blankets and furniture bits. The place looked like a cross between a stable and a refugee camp, which in truth it had become. The heat came not from magic but from layers. Layers of wood, layers of canvas, layers of effort. The shed she'd built around the original barn had no stove, no chimney, but the barn inside it did, and all the air trapped between the 2 structures was doing exactly what she hoped it would, insulating, holding. She hadn't known exactly how well it would work, only that it might be better than nothing, better than frostbitten snouts and silent stalls. She hadn't expected it to save an entire town's remaining livestock. She hadn't expected the silence, not the quiet of snow. Not the stillness of dawn, but the silence that fell between people who had mocked her and now stared at her as if they didn't know what she was, like she was some strange beast herself, something half myth, half-stubborn woman, standing in a wrapped barn that should have been nothing but had become a fortress. The horses kept coming, and the stories with them. Joseph Prewitt's last gelding had keeled over mid-step, nostrils steaming until they didn't. Clyde Maples's colt had chewed through a blanket and froze with the wool still in his teeth. Anna Fletcher's 3-year-old filly had broken her leg trying to leap a snowdrift and lay half-buried in the snow for an hour before someone reached her. Even the Crowsfield boys showed up eventually, red-faced and windburnt, dragging 2 mules behind them with raw ropes and shame in their eyes. Adah didn't say a word to them, just stepped aside, let them in. One of them muttered, "Ma'am," like he was at a funeral. The other refused to meet her eyes. On day 15, a child died, not at Adah's, not even nearby. A boy in the Eastern Bluff settlement, 4 miles out, buried by a collapse. Snow had built up on a sod roof, then broken through. The mother had screamed so loud, folks heard it through closed shutters. No one brought up Adah's barn that day. No one needed to. They were starting to whisper about something else now, about the cold itself, about whether it might outlast them. This wasn't just another rough winter. It was something different, longer, meaner. And if it didn't end soon, folks would start freezing to death in beds, not just animals in stalls. So when the preacher came to Adah's door, he wasn't asking to bless the horses. He wanted to move in, not permanently, of course. He phrased it more delicately, said he'd been led by the Lord to ensure the spiritual comfort of those under her roof. But his beard was rimed with ice, and his lips cracked when he spoke. Adah didn't answer with words. She handed him a bucket. "Tend the water," she said. "Then sweep out the west stall." The preacher nodded, took the bucket without protest. She wasn't running a church. She was keeping things alive. There were 23 horses in the barn by week's end, 4 goats, 7 dogs, 2 of which had followed someone in off the road and refused to leave, and a growing number of humans who had started coming not just to save livestock but to rest, to sit by the warmth and hear other voices again, to feel the ache of joints begin to fade. Some of them just stayed for a few hours. Others curled up against bales of hay and tried not to look too hopeful. Adah didn't send anyone away, but she didn't make it comfortable either. She rationed what little feed she had. She warned people not to use her wood. She made everyone work, hauling water, chopping what they could find, tending to frostbit hooves, scraping out stalls, wiping down horse legs with boiled vinegar to keep blood moving. Even the old widow from Pine Rill ended up sweeping manure with a broken broom. No one complained. Somehow the act of surviving inside that barn, the wrapped barn, the barn that everyone had mocked, made people quiet, made them focus. It was no longer a joke. It was a place to make it through the next hour, and then maybe the next. The freeze cracked on the 24th day. Not broke, not ended. Just cracked. A breeze came from the south that wasn't sharp as glass. Snow on roofs began to hiss with soft melt. A few drops pattered down the length of Adah's shed wall and didn't freeze solid on contact. It wasn't warmth yet, but it was the idea of it. And the morning after that, the sky turned grey instead of white, and folks began whispering that maybe the worst had passed. But Adah didn't believe it, not yet, because the nights were still brutal. And in the barn, the breath of 23 horses still steamed in plumes like ghosts trying to leave their chests. She kept her tools nearby, kept stuffing cracks, kept checking hooves, kept boiling water not just for drinking but for warmth, setting pails around the inner walls to radiate what little heat they had. No one called her crazy anymore. But some had started calling her Miss Iron, not to her face, but she heard it. The name stuck to the walls like smoke. The preacher, after his 3rd night in the barn, began leaving early each morning and returning by dusk. He brought news, said the feed store burned down trying to light a stove, said the Wilkins twins both lost fingers to frostbite, said the Thompson ranch lost a full roof. No one else had a working stable anymore. No one else had heat. By day 26, the Crowsfield boys came back a 3rd time, not for mules, for their little sister, 12 years old, shaking from cold, wrapped in 2 coats and a horse blanket. We heard the air in there don't bite," the older boy said. Adah stared at them, then stepped aside. The girl didn't say thank you. She just walked in like she'd been born there. That night, Adah stayed up sharpening a knife, not out of fear, not for defense, for the next animal that would arrive with hooves too overgrown to stand. She wasn't just sheltering, she was healing, patching, repairing. And as she worked, she realized something strange. She could barely hear the wind anymore, not because it had stopped, but because her barn wasn't just wrapped, it was buried. In snow, yes. In canvas, yes, but also in presence. So many bodies, so many heartbeats. The place breathed now, hummed, and that wrapping, mocked by so many weeks ago, had become something more. It was no longer a shed around a barn. It was a skin, a wall of protection, a line between life and the thing waiting outside. At 22 degran, even pride dies, even gossip. All that's left is who still stands, and tonight Adah did. In a shed-wrapped barn full of the last horses in the valley. On the 29th day, the wind changed direction. It didn't ease up, it didn't warm, but it shifted from north to west, and the valley began to echo different sounds. Boards groaning under strain, trees splitting in the night, crows returning, silently, perching on drifts they'd abandoned weeks earlier. And for the first time since the freeze began, you could smell something besides cold. Smoke. Someone's place was burning. Not from firewood, not a stove left untended. No, the dry, fast, roaring kind of fire that comes from a wall catching and no one there to put it out. Later they'd learn it was the Wilkins cabin. The same Wilkins boys who'd lost fingers. Their father was found 2 days after the thaw, curled up beside the hearth, teeth cracked from chattering. But that morning, the plume rose black and tall into a powder blue sky, and Adah watched it from the doorway of her wrapped barn, one hand shielding her eyes, the other resting gently on the head of a sleeping mule beside her boots. She didn't say anything, but she stepped back inside, rechecked the canvas seals on the west wall, ran her hands down the seams where the vapor barrier met the rafters. And she made a new rule, spoken loud enough for all to hear. No lanterns in here, no open flame past the stall line, no matches unless I say. Nobody argued. By now, the wrapped barn had become something like a town square, a breathing place, a center. Most of the valley's remaining livestock were gathered under that double roof now. Horses, goats, oxen. even a pair of terrified donkeys from the Frayne property that had been found huddled in a ditch behind a collapsed fence. But it wasn't just the animals anymore. People were staying overnight, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because here, for the first time in weeks, sleep didn't feel like a threat. Inside the wrapping, the air held. Steam rose in the mornings. There was no more frost inside the stalls. And despite the crowding, there was peace. Adah had organized everything by instinct. Horses along the left and center, people along the right. No cross-mingling past dusk. The preacher helped enforce it. The Prewitt boy, too. Even the Crowsfield boys had taken up the habit of hauling water twice daily from the iced-up stream down the ridge, smashing holes in the crusted top with axe blades to draw buckets. Miss Adah, the older one had started calling her. But Adah wasn't focused on names. She was focused on walls, because each night brought a new sound now. Not wind, not animals. Drip, water, not enough to melt the snowpack, but enough to begin threatening the seal she'd worked so hard to keep. Water meant collapse. Water meant rot. If a corner beam gave, or one of her patched roof panels sagged under melt, everything could come apart at once. So she climbed. Each night, in boots and coat and scarf, she climbed the roof of her own wrapping, listening for creaks, pressing her ear to the joints, feeling the give in the wood. She'd built this structure alone, one stubborn board after another, and she knew its voice like an old dog's bark. It was holding, but barely. On the 30th night, two things happened. 1, the wind finally stopped altogether, and 2, someone stole from her. It wasn't a theft like in a city, not coin, not jewelry, but feed. 2 full bags of it, gone by morning. She only noticed because she kept a tally, 1 page in a stitched notebook marked with pencil and smudged with straw dust. She didn't accuse anyone, didn't need to. By that point, those inside the barn had developed their own order. A kind of unspoken code had emerged. Who worked, who rested, who fetched, who mended. There were only 2 new faces that week, a pair of drifters no one knew, pale-eyed, thin-booted men who didn't say where they came from. One of them kept coughing behind his scarf. The other watched too quietly from the edges. When Adah approached them the next morning, she carried a pot of cooked oats in one hand and an old broken stirrup in the other. Without a word, she set the food down and handed them the stirrup. "Your shift's in 10 minutes, she said. "Ma'am?" one of them asked. She pointed to the barn's far end, where muck had started pooling beneath the corner stalls. "If it ain't shoveling, it's hauling. If it ain't hauling, it's patching. That's how it is here." The men didn't argue. They just nodded, took the stirrup like it was a shovel, and went to work. Adah didn't have to punish them. They knew what they took, and they knew they were still safer here than anywhere else. The thaw came on the 34th morning. Not a slow shift, not a trickle, a crack. Loud, wet, and final. Some said it started up on the North Ridge, where the sun hit hardest. Others claimed it was the Valley Creek that broke first. But whatever the cause, the result was unmistakable. Ice shearing like glass from rooftops. Snowbanks collapsing into mud, and air so suddenly different it felt like the inside of a breath. Inside Adah's barn, it started with the smell. Wet wood, damp straw, animal sweat, then the sweat itself. Horses shifted uneasily in their stalls. Dogs stood and shook out their coats. Even the preacher took off his jacket for the first time in weeks. But Adah didn't celebrate. She moved faster than ever, because she knew what melted could flood, what softened could collapse, and she'd built this wrapping by hand. She wasn't about to let it rot beneath her while others still needed it. She sent runners that day, Prewitt's boy and the youngest Crowsfield, up to the old mill for rope, down to the burnt Wilkins cabin for loose boards, across to the Fraynes to beg a handsaw. And then she went to work reinforcing, not rebuilding, not expanding, just buying one more day. One more day for the horses, one more day for the people, one more day for everything she'd kept alive. The town changed after that, not all at once. But the stories shifted. People started coming, not to beg, but to offer. The tanner's wife arrived with 2 pelts and said she'd trade for hay. The preacher began organizing proper watches, setting up a ledger on a feed barrel. Even Ruth, the woman with the twin boys, began helping Adah with hoof inspections, lifting legs with the confidence of someone who no longer felt helpless. The barn's center aisle had become a kind of main road, narrow, packed down, and warm from breath and bodies. The canvas-wrapped walls no longer looked strange to anyone. They looked right, as if they'd always been there. As if this is how barns were supposed to be. Even Clyde Maples showed up one morning with a bent head and a bundle of fresh cut wood over his shoulder. "Didn't bring no horses," he muttered. "Ain't got none left, but figured, might help patch something." Adah took the wood, didn't speak, just nodded once, and walked on. When the snow fully receded, folks began unwrapping their own barns, copying her. Some used tarps, Some used hay bales. Some nailed together makeshift lean-tos to cover stall doors. They all said the same thing, more or less. Should have done it like Adah did. But Adah didn't say "I told you so." She just kept tending her horses. By then, only 17 were left. Some had died despite the warmth. Others had been returned to new shelters once their owners rebuilt. But Adah's two remained. The same pair she'd started the winter with. Heavier now, calmer. They never shivered anymore. When she brushed them, they leaned into her hand. They trusted her, and that felt like enough. Late one night, weeks after the thaw, Ruth brought Adah a letter. It was from some man in Dawson Creek. Said he heard about her barn and wanted to offer land. Said someone up there needed a horse handler with "your kind of sense." Adah didn't read the letter twice. She folded it, set it beside the stove, and went out to the barn. The shed was still up, still strong, still warm, even without fire. The canvas didn't flap anymore. The planks didn't groan. The place had settled into something permanent. She walked the aisle once, ran her hand along the old wall, then the new one, paused by the place where she'd buried the feed that went missing, and smiled. Because in the end, they hadn't just survived. They'd changed. A wrapped barn, a stubborn widow, and an entire valley that learned the hard way that warmth wasn't just about fire. It was about planning, about listening, about wrapping something before it froze too hard to save. The thaw did not bring peace. It brought mess. Flooded roads, bloated wood, grain sacks turned to rot, dead livestock thawing in sun and stench. Spring on the frontier had always been the ugliest season. It peeled back what winter buried and made the living reckon with what had died. But this time was different. This time it felt like stepping through a graveyard that had once been a town. The preacher said the freeze had taken 17 lives in the valley. Some animals, some not. 2 children, 1 widow. A trapper who froze in a crouch with his rifle still loaded. A school teacher, found stiff at her desk with a lantern out beside her. Even the loudest mouths from the start of the season, Clyde's older cousin, the Frayne brothers, none made it. Their barns hadn't been wrapped, their stoves had cracked from overburn, and their animals either froze or panicked and ran. Adah didn't gloat, she grieved, quietly, in her own way. She didn't attend the preacher's first spring sermon, even though it was held just outside her barn, the place he now called a holy shelter. Instead, she spent that morning in the corner stall with her oldest mare, brushing loose hair, trimming cracked hooves, and humming a tune so low only the horses heard it. By mid-March, things started moving again, not in the celebratory way folks might have hoped, but slow, staggered movement. Wagons pulled down from sheds, wheels replaced, sleds turned back into carts. Roads thawed just enough for a few brave families to ride out to Dawson Creek for supplies. Or at least word. What came back was a mixture of rumors and truths. Every valley had lost something. A few had lost everything. One story said a ranch 10 miles south was reduced to ash after someone's blanket caught fire near a lean-to stove. Another said the town mill up north had been commandeered as emergency lodging by families with no barns left at all. Folks were wrapping houses now. Canvas, hay, dirt, anything. One man even showed up at Adah's with a full plan scrawled on butcher paper. A whole settlement he wanted to build, with her wrapped barn as the model. She didn't even open the paper. "Go build your own," she said. She wasn't interested in blueprints. Not yet. Her barn still stood, but the wrapping had started to peel. Weeks of meltwater had seeped into seams she couldn't reach, loosening nails, curling edges of the canvas. The old army tent she'd used for the west wall had rotted in 2 spots, and straw kept poking through a gap near the corner eaves. It wasn't failing, not entirely, but it wasn't what it had been. She could see the next step coming. Not just repair, rebuild, something stronger, something meant to last. So she stripped the worst of the canvas, salvaged what lumber she could from the original barn walls, and began building again, this time with help. Ruth came every morning with her boys. One held the nails, the other hammered. The Crowsfield boys brought dry logs on sleds. Even Clyde returned, more silent than before, with a saw in one hand and shame still riding on his shoulder. Adah didn't scold him, didn't joke, just handed him a measuring stick and told him to get the east wall flush. For the first time since she buried her husband, Adah wasn't working alone, and for the first time in the valley's memory, people were building not out of pride or expansion, but out of gratitude. What emerged wasn't just a barn anymore. It was something else, half stable, half hall, wider, with a double roof properly framed and braced, and a central aisle, tall enough for 2 men to stand shoulder to shoulder and not brush the rafters. They reused the best of the wrapping, the vapor barrier, the straw gaps, the offset inner wall, but framed it properly now, board by board, insulated with sawdust and mud. Adah insisted they mix in charcoal ash, said it slowed the mold. Everyone listened. Nobody argued, not anymore. When the barn was finished, They didn't have a name for it. No plaque, no marker, just one wall near the door where the preacher chalked something small. 20 centigrades, nothing else. Didn't need to. The barn stayed through spring and summer. The walls held. The wrapping improved and hardened, kept things dry even in sudden rains. The preacher started using the west stall for sermons, said it had better acoustics than the chapel. Ruth taught her boys how to muck and saddle. The Crowsfield boys left 2 pups behind to guard the place. By the time fall crept in again, and the first flakes returned to the air, everyone had the same thought. Would it come again? That kind of freeze. That kind of silence. Ada didn't answer aloud. She didn't need to. She added an extra canvas layer in October. Stocked wood earlier than anyone else, buried her feed sacks in sealed crates lined with charcoal ash, reinforced the barn's second outer wall, and when a new widow down the ridge started hammering wood around her own coop, Ada stopped by one evening and left a basket of dry straw. Didn't say a word, just left it by the fence. There were still jokes, still people in other counties who said the freeze wasn't so bad, still men who said barns didn't need coats, but not here, not anymore, not in this valley, because they remembered. They remembered the sound of silence when the wind died, the smell of thawed death, the warmth of horse breath in a barn no one believed in, and they remembered who rapped it, who kept rapping, even when everyone laughed, even when the sky turned against them, even when it reached 20 centigrades. The second winter came quieter, no fanfare, no black smoke on the horizon, no screaming wind in the night, just the slow, steady thickening of the sky. Trees dusted white before sundown, roofs turning slick and heavy, hoofprints disappearing behind horses almost before the next step fell. And this time no one laughed at the woman with a wrapped barn. They copied her. The Prewitts did it first, framed a double wall around their rebuilt stable, lined the inside with pine bark and straw soaked in lye to keep out rodents. The Maples built a false roof, canvas trapped between rafters and tar-painted slats. After Clyde admitted he still heard the sound of his uncle's horses wheezing in his sleep, Ruth and the twins wrapped their chicken coop too, tacking up stitched burlap like a second skin. Ada watched it all with a kind of quiet detachment. She didn't offer advice. She didn't correct bad framing or warn against sloppy seams. She simply stood in her own yard, arms folded, smoke curling from the stovepipe rising from the barn's center, and waited. Because she knew better than anyone, nature didn't always knock twice. When the freeze hit again, it came later, end of January. Most thought they'd escaped it, that maybe the earth had given them a reprieve. But it came just the same. Not as long, not as cruel, but fast and deep. One night it was just frost on the windows. The next it was 14 degrees and falling. But this time, it wasn't the animals that suffered first. It was the people. A flue crept through the valley like smoke. Someone said it came down from Dawson. Someone else said the Frains brought it back with them after their failed supply run. But however it came, it spread fast. And this time, it didn't freeze the lungs from outside, it burned them from within. Ada caught it on the 5th day. Not bad at first, just a cough, but she felt it behind her ribs, a pull like something grating bone. She worked anyway, shoveling snow from the barn's gutters, hauling wood with Ruth, checking the frost lines by lantern. But by the second week she was shaking too hard to lift a saw. Her knees buckled after tossing a single bucket of feed. Her breath came in sharp, glassy drags that scared even the horses. The barn was warm, but she was getting cold, and for the first time since the day she'd wrapped it, she let someone else step in. Ruth came at dusk with a pot of broth and stayed through the night. So did the preacher, who moved his sermon to a whisper beside Ada's cot in the barn's corner, just above where the snow used to seep in through the cracks she'd patched alone a year ago. The Crowsfield boys watched the door. Prewitt's son mucked the stalls. Even Clyde showed up with a stack of firewood and a rare, stiff smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. "Ain't right," he muttered, setting the wood down beside her stove. "You did all this. Ain't right you lay down while we stand." Ada rasped something too low to hear. He leaned in. She repeated it, clearer this time. "Then stand right." Clyde didn't answer, just swallowed and went to work. She didn't die. Not that week, not that winter. Her fever broke on the 9th day. Ruth said it was the broth. The preacher said it was God. Ada said nothing. But she knew what had kept her alive. The warmth, not just the heat, the warmth of something held. The echo of what she'd built now given back to her, wrapped as she had once wrapped it. She stayed in the barn for a week longer, not because she had to, but because she couldn't leave. Not yet. She needed to see it, feel it. The way people moved through the space now, the way they looked up at the rafters with reverence, how they placed their hands on the walls like it meant something sacred. It was still just wood, still just canvas and nails and straw, but it held, and in holding it had become something else entirely. When spring came again, she didn't rebuild, she didn't add mad. She didn't need to. Instead, she sat by the outer door one morning with a tin cup of black coffee and watched as two children, Ruth's twins, led a colt through the center aisle of the barn, their hands light on the rope, their voices soft, their steps careful. They didn't ask her how to train it, they just did it. Inside her barn, inside the walls she'd once wrapped alone while every man for 10 miles had laughed or turned away. They didn't laugh anymore. Now they followed. The preacher eventually named the place in a letter to the county. He called it Sanctuary Shed. Adah hated the name, told him so outright, said it made it sound like a chapel with manure. But the letter stuck, and soon enough, even people from the next valley started using it. Traders would ask, "That near the Sanctuary Shed?" Old women asked if they could send their daughters to learn Adah's way. Even a newspaper man came again, same one as before, clean boots, cleaner smile. Said he'd heard rumors of a frontier miracle woman with a barn that breathes. She told him to leave before dusk and take his miracle talk with him. Adah grew slower in the 3rd year. Her hands ached in the cold now. Her hips clicked when she walked, but her mind stayed sharp. She read every ledger the preacher kept. She corrected every foaling note Ruth made. She never missed a single stall cleaning. Not really. She just watched now, arms crossed, leaning against the stall post, ready to bark orders if someone left hay too close to manure. She'd become the spine of the barn, not always seen, but if you removed her, nothing stood straight. The day she died, the sky was clear. It was March, the first real thaw, drips falling from rooftops, crusted mud showing through the last of the white. Prewitt's boy found her sitting in the stall beside her oldest mare, hand resting on the horse's side like she was just listening for breath. Her eyes were closed. Her lips weren't blue, and there was no struggle. She'd gone quiet, gone still, gone warm, wrapped like everything she'd ever tried to save. They buried her in the barn, not inside, but just behind it, under the wide shadow of the double roof. They wrapped her in canvas, old, stained, patched a dozen times over. The same piece she'd once used on the west wall, her first winter. She'd never thrown it out, said it still kept the rain off fine. The preacher spoke soft words. The horses were silent. Ruth stood with her boys, one holding Adah's last brush, and on the barn wall, they etched a new line. 22nd me 1 Adah, nothing else. Didn't need to, because everyone remembered. They remembered the wind, the silence, the cold, the night when it felt like the world had given up, and they remembered the woman who hadn't, the widow they mocked. The barn she wrapped, the lives she saved, all of it still standing, still warm, still holding.